Okay, so I thought on this Christmas Eve, nothing would be a better gift than to talk about elections and the different types of elections that we have, and maybe a brief history of elections. You know, when we get to a general election, which is usually held in November, you've got two candidates running for governor, two candidates running for senators, because we operate under a two-party system for the most part. But how did those people get to be their party's nominee for that office is the question. Well, if we were to go back into history, the original way was through what we would call a caucus. Now, caucus is a fancy word that means to meet, but party leaders would meet or caucus and then decide who they wanted to run for every office. Now, that's not very democratic because you have no say-so, but party leaders do. But it was a beginning. And I should point out, there is a version of the caucus that still exists today in other states and partly in Texas. By the 1830s and 40s, they had gone to a convention system where you would send delegates to a convention, and then those delegates would nominate candidates for office. It actually comes a little bit out of the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, where they get this idea. So what you would have is you'd have a series of conventions. You would have a county convention to nominate county candidates. You'd have a state convention to nominate state candidates, and then you'd have a national convention, which purpose was to nominate president and vice president. Now, this is more democratic, obviously, because more people are involved, but it was also open to a lot of corruption, that you could bribe people off to vote for your candidate at the county level. Get one of those delegates, say, look, if my candidate wins, you'll get some money. If my candidate wins, you'll get a job. That wasn't unusual. By the Progressive Era, the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, a new system came up called the direct primary. In the direct primary, voters decide who's going to be on the general election ballot in November. So you have an election in Texas, we have it in March, where voters in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they both go to a primary election spot, and they vote on which Democrats they want to be representing them in the general election and which Republicans they want representing them. Now, that's a lot more democratic. Unfortunately, what we see in Texas is that primary voter turnout is extremely low, and only the real strong ideologues win. I mean, when you look at some of the problems that we face in the United States with this hyper-partisanship, it's partly out of the primary system, that primary voters tend to be more to the left or much more to the right, and they will support candidates that are on these far ends, rather than those that may be a little bit more toward the middle, where most Americans are. This is a problem, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, in Texas, you have three types of in the United States, you have three types of primaries. You have an open primary. In an open primary, it's open to anybody. You can pick either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party primary to vote in. You can't vote in both, you only get one choice, but you can pick either one. It's open to anybody. Now, the opposite of that is a closed primary, which says that you have to be a member of the party to vote in the party's primary. So that you have to be a member of the Republican Party to vote in the Republican primary, or a Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary. Now, if you claim that you're a libertarian or you're an independent, then you don't get to vote in the primaries. You've got to be a member of the party. Now, this is the problem that we face in these primary elections, is that Texas is a bit confusing. And Texas, by law, we have a closed primary. It says you have to be a member of the party to vote in the party's primary. But in practice, it's open, because your voter registration card, if you take a look at it, it doesn't say what party you belong to. You actually declare your party allegiance by going in and voting in the primary. So when you go in to the primary and you vote and say, I want to vote in the Republican primary, I want to vote in the Democratic primary, whatever, you are for that election declaring yourself a Republican or a Democrat. So in other words, by law, we operate a closed primary, but in practice, it's an open primary. Now, I know you're saying, well, wait a minute, Brian, I just rolled this video back a few minutes. Why would you do that? But anyway, you did. You said there were three types of primaries. There's one called a blanket primary that's used in a couple of states, I think Washington and Alaska, and maybe the two states that do it, where you can cross over in each race and vote in those primary races, but not used too much here. So some states are now using that whoever gets the top 2 votes, even if they're from the same party, gets to go on to the general election. I think California is one of those. Anyway, so you get to this primary election. Now, in the primary election, and there will be a test question over this, you have to get a majority of the vote. That's 51. That's 50% plus 1, right? That's a majority. Now, to do that, it can be difficult because you're going to be talking about a lot of different candidates running. Usually, there's 7 or 8 candidates, and those votes are all going to be split out, obviously. So if nobody gets a majority of the vote, then you're required to have a runoff primary, which usually it can happen anytime. I think that during COVID, it was in July, just because of the delay of city elections and other local elections. They were trying to spread those out so not as many people were there. But usually it's in June or May where you have a runoff primary. In a runoff primary, the top 2 vote getters, whether it was in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary or both, the top 2 vote getters move on. The rest are dropped out, because if you only have 2 people in the race, then the choices are that either there's going to be a tie, which is highly unlikely, or somebody's going to get a majority. Now, if there's a tie, there's a lot of ways of figuring out how you're going to do that. You can flip a coin, pull a name out of the hat, and go from there. Now, once you win the primary, either through straight winning it the first time or going to a runoff primary, which, by the way, the voter turnout is even less there, then you go to the general election. And in the general election, which is held in November, there you don't need a majority of the vote to win a general election. This will be a test question too. You don't need a majority of the vote. All you need is a plurality. A plurality means whoever gets the most votes. 43%. If you get 43% of the vote and your opponent gets 40% and there's a third candidate who gets 28%, I don't know if that adds up to 100%. You can add up here in a little bit. You win. All you have to get is a plurality of the vote, not a majority. So that's how that works. Let's briefly talk about campaign finance. Now, at the federal level, there are limits on how much you can give to candidates. I think, and it adjusts because of inflation. I think it's roughly around $2,700 per candidate. In Texas, there are no limits. So when I was running, when I was mayor, and I was on city council for 17 years, if somebody wanted to give me $1 billion to run for office, they could. They could give me $100,000. Actually, I think my dad once gave me $50, and then he said that was a loan and I had to pay him back. Thanks, Dad. Well, so there are no limits on how much you can give to a candidate. And that's sometimes why races can get pretty expensive. And I think it's important upon us to make sure that we know where that money's coming from, because when you give to a candidate, let's say I was going to run for county commissioner, or I was going to run for state representative. When I get money, I have to report all that money on a form. And in that form, I have to say who gave me the money, what's their address, what's their occupation, and how much money they gave me. And that's public knowledge. And then when I spend that money, I also have to show what I spent that money for and when I spent it. Did I spend it on a consultant? Did I spend it on signs? Did I spend it on radio and TV ads? And all that's turned into the chief elections officer of the state, which is the Texas Secretary of State, which will also be a test question. And that's going to be in a form that's going to be out there, and it's public knowledge. You can look that up. You can ask to your city or through your school district or wherever you want to. You can ask to see a copy of that to see where the money's coming from. Sometimes that's interesting to see where money's coming from and how much is being given to a particular candidate. So it can be pretty expensive to run in some of these elections. I think even in Canada, I think one election we spent $20,000 on a candidate, $20,000 for a city of 8,000. Some races in Fort Worth and Arlington can get close to $100,000. And you could spend over $1 million to run for a Texas Senate seat. It's expensive. And there is some concern that that money can be a corrupting influence, obviously, because when you start chasing the money, there is sort of you feel like you have an obligation. And even if you don't, you vote the way you want to vote, but somebody's giving you a lot of money, even that may disagree, there's always that impression that you may have been bought off, which I've never met anybody who's been bought off, but the impression is out there. Now, you can give as individuals, but corporations and labor unions are forbidden from directly giving money to candidates. So what they do is they form political action committees. These are groups of like-minded individuals who pool their money and then donate to candidates. They raise money and donate to candidates that they want to see get elected. I believe that shows up on the test. So I'm keeping this brief. I already have a video up about this, so you can see a little bit more in detail. But I thought I would give you this one sort of as a Christmas present, I guess, holiday present, whatever you want to call it, or just out of the generosity of my very tiny professor heart, I guess. So anyway, I hope you guys have a nice holiday. I will record another video tomorrow to remind you about the test, and probably tomorrow I'm going to record a video on the party organization, and that is a really boring video. So if you're going to watch that video, don't watch it on Christmas. Watch it the next day when you're sort of already tired of all the party and celebration. It might actually help you sleep a little bit. So have a good holiday. Talk to you tomorrow.